Ever feel like just constantly bombarded by bad news? Like you pick up your phone just to glance at a headline or whatever, and suddenly, boom,
Yeah.
you're spiraling down this rabbit hole of negativity.
It's so true.
It's like our brains are almost wired to get sucked into that doom and gloom,
Yeah.
And today we're really going to dive deep into that whole thing, that doom scrolling, that catastrophizing, and how it seems to hit differently for folks with autism, especially those who've also dealt with religious trauma.
And I think what's so fascinating about this deep dive is that we aren't just talking about individual experiences, right? It's about how all of these things, these different facets, can actually connect and kind of build on one another.
Totally. It's like a chain reaction almost.
Yeah.
And just to be clear, we're not trying to play doctor here or anything like that,
Right.
but just understanding those connections, even just a little bit, can be really empowering.
For sure.
So we often hear about doom scrolling,
Right.
right? But what exactly are we talking about here? It's that feeling, of just endlessly scrolling through negative news. It's like a train you can't get off of.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And then there's catastrophizing, which is basically what? Our brains hitting the panic button.
Mm.
Like if we read a news story about, I don't know, a minor earthquake or something, suddenly our brains are convinced that, okay, the whole city's going to crumble. I need to start packing a go bag right now.
Right. It's that immediate jump to the worst case scenario, even if, logically it's not even likely.
Exactly.
And then when we start adding in the aspect of religious trauma, which is often called RTS, it just creates this whole other layer of complexity to the equation. And just to
Yeah.
be clear, RTS isn't about criticizing religion as a whole or any religion in particular.
Right.
It's about acknowledging that certain religious experiences, especially within certain environments or groups, can actually be really damaging and hurtful.
It's about the impact those experiences can have, especially on people who are neurodivergent.
Mm.
And speaking of impact, let's talk about the link between autism and doom scrolling. Why is it that some autistic folks might be more prone to getting caught in that spiral of negativity? What's the connection there?
Well, research suggests that people with autism might experience the anxiety and stress from, say, news a little differently than neurotypical individuals. And one contributing factor could be sensory input.
Interesting.
For many autistic individuals, the world can feel a bit like a sensory roller coaster, right? Lights seem brighter, sounds are louder, even just everyday textures can feel completely overwhelming. So now imagine that, but then also having this constant barrage of information coming at you with doom scrolling.
Oh, wow. Yeah, like cranking that sensory input up to 11.
Exactly. Exactly. And if we think about how some autistic individuals might process information, there's often this tendency to fixate on details. So not only is there this potentially heightened sensory experience, but certain details, especially negative ones, might kind of lock in almost and be harder to let go of.
Wow. Okay, I'm starting to really see how this all fits together.
Yeah.
So we've got this potential for sensory overload from, just the constant news, right? Plus that tendency to fixate on all those negative details.
Yeah.
It's no wonder doom scrolling can be so hard to break free from. But where does catastrophizing come into all of this? What happens when those already negative details then get caught in that what-if spiral?
Yeah, and that's where things can get really intense, especially for those who are already prone to that catastrophizing. And we actually came across a really powerful example of this in a blog post from Cheap ABA, which is a really cool online platform dedicated to making applied behavior analysis therapy resources more accessible, which is awesome.
That is awesome, yeah.
And in their post, they described how someone read a news article about a house fire, and immediately their brain went to, my house is going to burn down, even though they lived in a totally different city.
Wow. That's a really vivid example of how catastrophizing can just completely take over. It's
Yeah.
not even just reading a scary headline. It's like your brain immediately transporting that scary situation right into your own life, even if it makes absolutely no logical sense.
Precisely. And remember, this isn't about being intentionally negative or pessimistic or anything like that. It's about recognizing that for some people,
Excellent.
especially those with autism who might already be dealing with anxiety, sensory sensitivities, all these things, those what-if thoughts can become almost impossible to ignore.
So we've got this potential for heightened sensory experiences, we've got the tendency to fixate, and now this added layer of catastrophizing. That's a lot to unpack.
And we haven't even touched on religious trauma yet.
Right, and that's where things get even more complex, and that's why, having this understanding, this broader understanding of how all these factors can interplay is absolutely crucial. Because for some autistic individuals, particularly those who've experienced religious trauma, the challenges we've been discussing, they can be even more magnified. This is where things get really nuanced, right?
Hmm.
Because we're talking about like the intersection of neurodiversity and experiences that can be so deeply personal and, frankly, really tough to talk about.
Absolutely. And it's so important, I think, as always, that we approach this with sensitivity and we acknowledge that, religious trauma doesn't invalidate anyone's faith or their spirituality or anything like that.
Right.
It's more about recognizing that certain religious experiences, particularly within certain environments, can have these really, harmful effects on a person's mental well-being. And that's really what we're looking at here.
It's not about the religion itself, but the impact
Right.
of those
That's-
experiences.
Yes.
And you mentioned environments. So what is it about certain religious settings that might be particularly tough, especially for somebody with autism?
Well, imagine for a second an environment that's very rigid, that's very structured, where there's this heavy emphasis on, following strict rules, conforming to very specific social expectations. And these types of environments, which unfortunately, can be found in some religious groups, right? They can be really challenging for autistic individuals who, they process social cues differently. Often they might struggle with sensory overload in those kinds of highly stimulating settings.
Yeah, it's like trying to fit a square peg into a round hole, isn't it?
Yeah.
And when you're constantly surrounded by these messages that make you feel like you're not good enough, that you need to be fixed because of who you are,
Oh, absolutely.
that can really take a toll.
And think about how, that kind of environment might then interact with catastrophizing, right?
Oh, yeah.
It's easy to see how someone might really internalize those messages of not being good enough and apply that to every single aspect of their lives.
It's like that feeling of not belonging just gets amplified, doesn't it?
It does.
Like when you're already dealing with, the anxiety that can come with sensory overload and that tendency to kind of get caught in those what-if spirals, then you add in this whole other weight of past religious trauma.
Yeah.
It's like you're carrying around this invisible backpack full of rocks.
And the thing is, there's actually a growing body of research that shows the very real impact of religious trauma on mental health in general.
Right.
Studies have found that individuals who've experienced RTS are much more likely to experience things like, anxiety, depression, even PTSD.
Wow.
And this is on top of, the already higher rates of these issues within, like, the autistic community.
Right.
So it really is, it can be, kind of this perfect storm of mental health challenges.
It is. And let's not forget about that stat that we mentioned earlier about how many autistic individuals rely on social media for news. So you combine that with the fact that a lot of people, neurodivergent or not, tend to process negative information more deeply than positive information.
Yeah.
And it's just a recipe for getting really stuck in that cycle of doom scrolling and despair.
Absolutely. And it's this complex interplay of factors that can make it incredibly hard to break free. But it's so important to remember that, even though it feels overwhelming at times, it's not a hopeless situation. Not at all.
Right.
Understanding these connections, as challenging as it can be, is actually a huge step toward reclaiming our well-being.
I love that you framed it that way because it's not about pretending that these challenges don't exist. It's about recognizing them,
Oh.
understanding them, and then figuring out what we can do to navigate them in a way that's empowering, right?
Exactly. I always say knowledge is power.
Yeah.
And what's so important here is that there are actually really practical strategies we can use to manage these challenges. There are things we can start doing literally today to start regaining a sense of control and build resilience.
Okay, so less doom and gloom, more taking action. I love that.
Yeah.
Let's dive into those strategies. What are some things that folks listening can actually do to start feeling more empowered?
So one of the most powerful things we can do is really set those boundaries with how much media we're consuming.
Totally, yeah.
Yeah.
It's not about going cold turkey and living
Right.
off the grid.
Exactly. Yeah.
It's just about being a little bit more mindful about our news diet.
Precisely. I always think about it kind of like this. If you were trying to eat healthier, you wouldn't eat cake for every single meal, right?
Right.
You'd want to focus on incorporating more fruits, vegetables, balanced choices.
Yes.
It's the same with information. We really need to be mindful about what we're feeding our minds. Choose reliable sources. Limit that exposure to those overly negative things. And maybe even think about designating specific times for checking news instead of just letting it kind of seep into every single moment of your day.
Right, so it's about creating that breathing room, right?
Yes, exactly.
Between ourselves and this constant influx of information all the time.
Mhm. Exactly. And speaking of breathing room, that's where I think mindfulness and grounding techniques can really come in. These can be such game changers when it comes to, managing anxiety, pulling ourselves back from like the brink of catastrophizing. And the
Oh,
best part is you don't need to be a meditation guru or anything to benefit from them.
right. Give us the lowdown on these grounding techniques, because I think sometimes people hear like mindfulness and they imagine they need to be like, I don't know, sitting on a mountaintop somewhere,
Right, exactly.
wearing robes.
Yeah.
What are some like practical things that anybody can do, like in their living room, while they're like waiting for the coffee to brew, whatever it is?
Totally. Yeah. Mindfulness really doesn't require any fancy equipment or retreats or anything like that. Something as simple as just taking a few deep breaths can make a world of
Oh, for
difference.
sure. Yeah.
There's actually a technique called the 4-7-8 breath where
Oh.
you inhale for a count of 4, hold for a count of 7, and exhale for a count of 8. It's like a mini vacation for your nervous system.
It's amazing how something so simple can have such a profound effect, right?
I know.
What are some other like grounding techniques
Mm.
that can help pull us back into like the present moment when our brain wants to run away with those what ifs?
Yeah, yeah. There's another one. It's called the 5-4-3-2-1 method. And basically, you just name 5 things that you can see around you, 4 things that you can touch, 3 things that you can hear, 2 things you can smell, and 1 thing that you can taste.
Oh,
It's
interesting.
another really good one to help shift that focus away from those spiraling thoughts and kind of bring you back into your immediate
It's
surroundings.
like hitting the reset button a little bit.
Yes,
I
exactly.
love these. These are like so easy to remember too. What else can people do in terms of like navigating these challenges and maybe feeling a little less alone?
Yeah, that's a really great point. And, at CHIP ABA, they really emphasize the importance of seeking support.
Yeah.
And, whether it's therapy, support groups, or even just talking to like a trusted friend or a family member, just connecting with others is so crucial. For individuals who are dealing with religious trauma specifically, finding a therapist who specializes in RTS can be incredibly validating and healing.
Right.
So just remembering you don't have to go through this alone is huge.
It's like building your own personal support squad, right?
Exactly.
And sometimes just knowing you're not the only one going through something can make all the difference in the world.
You really can.
Beyond just like talking to someone, are there like other things that people can do, to help themselves, especially maybe in those moments where they're feeling really overwhelmed?
Yeah, I think never underestimate the power of like positive offline
Oh,
activities. Get
yeah.
out in nature, engage in hobbies that you really enjoy, spend time with loved ones. Anything that brings you joy and helps you feel more connected to kind of the world around you, I think is so, so important. It's about counteracting that digital negativity with some real life positivity.
I love that. Sometimes the best antidote to like digital overload is like a healthy dose of the real world. Yeah.
Right, right, for sure. Wow. Okay, so we covered so much ground today.
Free tip.
From like understanding why doom scrolling and catastrophizing and religious trauma can be especially tough for people with autism
Right.
to exploring like this whole toolbox of strategies to kind of deal with it. It feels empowering to just like have this knowledge, don't you think?
It really does, because knowledge is empowering, but it's what we do with that knowledge that
Yeah.
really makes a difference, right?
Totally, totally.
And I think what this conversation has highlighted is that there's so many things within our control,
Yeah.
so many ways to reclaim our well-being, even when faced with, these really complex challenges. Absolutely. We can set those healthy boundaries. We can practice mindfulness.
Yes.
We can build that incredible support system like you were talking about.
Yes.
And we can get out there and embrace all those things that make
Yeah.
us feel alive.
Yes.
Those are all wins in my book. And before we wrap up, I actually have one final thought,
All right, yeah.
something for you, our amazing listener,
Okay.
to ponder maybe
Yeah.
after the show is over.
I love it.
So we've talked a lot about how overwhelming the online world can be, especially for neurodivergent folks, but really for everyone, you know? So here's my question. What if we all, as individuals, but also as a society, made a more conscious effort to create online spaces that are more supportive, more understanding, less anxiety-inducing? What would that even look like? How can we each do our part to contribute to a digital world that feels less like a minefield and more like a supportive community?
Ooh, that's a deep dive I would love to explore further.
Me too. But for now, that's all the time we have. Until next time, be kind to yourselves, be kind to each other, and keep those beautiful brains curious.